Like everyone else in this volatile time, you've thought about what you would do when the sirens went off and your phone displayed that fatal final message. You thought you'd have a girlfriend or at least a fling to cozy up to. You've always pictured things ending that way, even though you could count on one hand the amount of times you'd manage to even have a girl stay the night, let alone want to cozy up to you in the face of annihilation. You'd always pictured yourself lying shirtless in bed, somehow more buff in this scenario, like you'd finally turned your life around. You'd stoically comfort her in those last moments on Earth. But no, instead you're alone, taking a bubble bath. There are people you could call, but they no doubt have people they're already calling. People much higher on their priority list than you. Instead, you decide to wait for the end in the tub, watching the bubbles fizzle out. You take a swig from the flask you already had ready, and you add a splash more of hot water. Then you smash open the window so you can see outside, and in doing so, giving your neighbors one last look at your naked body, just in case that's something they ever wanted to see. And then you settle in and wait for the end. You watch as the sky starts to light up and you take one last drink. And then racing towards you and your house and your city is the podcast Inside Your House by Annie Marie Morgan and Kevin Schrock, with today's episode written by Farnsworth Wright and originally published in Weird Tales Magazine, Volume 2, Number 3. Episode 21, An Adventure in the Fourth Dimension. The thought of meteors terrifies me. They have a disagreeable habit of coming down and killing people at the most inopportune times. That is why I was so startled when I saw a large object hurtling towards me out of the sky as I was walking along the lakefront recently in my city of Chicago. I shivered. Was this the end? I began to say my prayers. But to my astonishment, the onrushing missile struck the grass beside me without the slightest jar. I gasped, and thousands of singular objects began to detach themselves. They bounded from the mass and suddenly increased in size from 1 inch to 3 feet in diameter. They were entirely round and covered in teeth, and on each tooth were 10 ears constantly in motion, and each ear carried a quizzical eye. The dwarfish creatures rolled rapidly on the ground, the ears serving as legs and hands and tentacles and whatnot, propelling them with incredible speed. Sometimes they stood on only 4 or 5 of their ears and then suddenly pressed hard against the ground with 1,000 ears at once, thus bounding high into the air. They lit without jar, for the ears acted as shock absorbers and broke their fall. Surely these are explorers from Mars or Venus, I thought, as the funny bounding creatures filled the air. You're wrong. They're Jupiterians, said a voice beside me. I recognized that voice. It was Professor Nutt. You probably know him. Ahem, he said. Ahem. And then once more he repeated. Ahem. Interesting, if true, I remarked. And what might Jupiterians be? Well, they might be men, but they're not, he snapped. They're people from the planet Jupiter. Out of your ignorance, though, you thought they might be Martians or Venusians. But you were wrong. For Mars and Venus have people of 3 dimensions, like ourselves. Jupiterians are entirely different. There are 600,000 of them in this Jupiterian airship. I was so overjoyed at finding someone who could tell me about them that I didn't think to ask him about how he knew these startling facts. Where's this airship you speak of? I asked. There it is, he answered rather grandiloquently and pointed to an empty spot on the grass. I looked carefully and made out a vast, transparent globe, apparently of glass, which was rapidly becoming visible because of the Chicago dust that was settling upon it. I approached and touched it with my hand. It gave forth a metallic ring. Ah, laughed the professor, you thought it was glass, but it's made of Jupiterian steel. Look out! I sprang back at his warning, and the last 100,000 leapt out of the globe, passing right through the transparent metal of which it was composed. Nom de mademoiselle, I exclaimed in astonishment. This was a swear word I had learned in France when I was in the army. Nom de mademoiselle, I repeated, for I like to show off my knowledge of the language. How can they pass through the glass without breaking it?
Through the Jupiterian steel, you mean?
Said Professor Nutt severely. I told you before that it's not glass. Jupiterian steel has 4 dimensions, and they pass through the 4th dimension. That's why you can't see the metal, for your eyes are only 3-dimensional. Are the Jupiterian people 4-dimensional? I asked, awed.
Certainly,
said Nutt rather irritably.
Then how is it I can see them?
I exclaimed triumphantly. You see only 3 of their 4 dimensions, he replied. The other one is inside. I turned to look again at the Jupiterians, who had now covered the whole of the waterfront. One of them sprang lightly 50 feet into the air and extended 100 ears like tentacles and seized an English sparrow. He crushed the sparrow with some score or more of his teeth, which, as I have said, covered his whole body. In less than a minute, the poor bird was chewed to pieces. I looked closer, and I saw that the Jupiterian had no mouth. Nom de mademoiselle, I exclaimed for a 3rd time.
How did they get the bird into its stomach?
All through the 4th dimension, said Professor Nutt. It was true. The chewed-up pieces of the bird were suddenly tossed into the air, and the Jupiterian sprang lightly after them. In midair, he turned inside out and caught the pieces of the bird on his stomach and lit on the grass again, right side up with care. Did you see that? I exclaimed in a hushed voice.
Why can't I turn inside out that way? Well, it's 'cause you're not 4-dimensional,
replied the professor, a trace of annoyance in his voice.
It's a beautiful thing to have 4 dimensions,
he rhapsodized. Your Jupiterian is the only true intellectual, for he alone can truly reflect. He turns his gaze in upon himself.
And sees what he had for breakfast? I gasped. And what his neighbors had too?
Your questions are childish, said the professor wearily. The Jupiterian, of course, can look into the soul of things and see what his neighbors had for breakfast, as you so vulgarly express it. But Jupiterians turn their thoughts to higher things. Creatures now surrounded me, their ears turned inward, as if they were supplicating. What do they want? I asked the professor. They want something to drink, he replied. They're pointing their ears towards their stomachs to show that they are thirsty. Oh, I said, and pointed towards the lake. There is the fresh, cool water of the lake if they're thirsty. Oh, don't be fantastic, said Professor Nutt. It isn't the water they want. He fixed his stern and pitiless gaze on my hip pocket, and I turned pale, for it was my last pint. But I had to submit. If you've ever had Professor Nutt's cold, accusing eyes on you, you will know just how I felt. I drew the flask from my pocket and handed it to the chief Jupiterian, who waggled his ears in joy. Immediately there was pandemonium, if you know what I mean. 10,000 times 10,000 ears seized the cork and pulled it out with a resounding pop. One thirsty Jupiterian passed right through the glass and into the bottle in his eagerness to get at the contents and nearly drowned for his pains. You see how useful it is to be 4-dimensional, remarked the professor. You could get into any cellar in the world by merely passing through the walls, and into any beer keg the same way. But, I argued, how did this insect get through the glass and into the whiskey bottle? Glass has only 3 dimensions, just like everything else in this world. Well, don't call him an insect, Nutt sharply reprimanded me. He's a Jupiterian, and as such he's infinitely superior to you and me. He passed through the glass because he is a 4-dimensional, even though the glass isn't. If you had 4 dimensions, you could untie any knot by merely passing it through itself. You could turn inside out, pass through yourself until your right hand became your left hand, and change into your own image as you see it in the looking glass. Nom de mademoiselle, I exclaimed for the 4th time. A distant noise of barking was borne to my ears by the breeze. All the dogs in the city seemed to have gone wild. They're disturbed by the talking of the Jupiterians, explained the professor. It's too high-pitched for clodhopper human ears to hear, unless they have unusual range, but the dogs can hear it plainly. I listened and finally made out a very shrill humming, higher than any sound I had ever heard before in my life, and infinitely sweet and piercing. Ah, I'm hearing 4-dimensional sounds, I thought aloud.
Wrong, as usual,
exasperated the professor with much heat. Sound has no dimensions. It proceeds in waves and bends back upon itself until it meets itself at an infinite distance from the starting point. There are three reasons why you can't hear the music of the spheres. The first is because it's bent away from the Earth by the force of the gravity as it passes the sun. The second is because your ears are not attuned to so shrill a sound, and the third is because there is no music of the spheres. The first two reasons are really unnecessary in light of the third, but a scientific mind such as mine is not content with one reason, where three can be adduced just as easily. Shades of Sir Oliver Lodge, I ejaculated. Sir Oliver is alive, the professor corrected me. A man does not become a shade until after his death. Then he becomes a four-dimensional creature, like the Jupiterians, only different. Non de mademoiselle, I commented. Say something sensible, he reprimanded me. For the love of Einstein, how do you know all these things about the Jupiterians? I asked, a sudden suspicion flashing across what I'm pleased to call my mind.
Ah, Einstein, yes,
exclaimed Nutt, greatly pleased. My mother's father's name was Einstein. Then are you related to... No, I'm not related, he interrupted, but my mother's father is. A sort of fourth-dimensional relationship, I suppose, I remarked sarcastically. At that moment, the air became vibrant with an invisible sound. The Jupiterians came rolling from all directions, as if they had suddenly heard the dinner bell. They bounded through the Jupiterian steel of the globe and immediately shrank in size from 3 feet to 1 inch. The Jupiterian assembly call just blew, explained the professor. Notice how the passengers draw into themselves. 600,000 are now packed into that globe. Our elevated railroad misses a great opportunity by not having four-dimensional creatures to deal with. Well, they pack us in just as tight, I ventured to remark. The globe had begun to shoot into the air when there came from behind me a high-pitched wail of distress, a shriller and higher sound than had ever before been heard by human ears, or so the professor assured me. The chief Jupiterian had been left behind. It was he who had passed into the whiskey bottle. Not content with getting the lion's share of the contents, he had surrounded the bottle in his pleasant four-dimensional way, and now he could not get rid of it. Why doesn't he turn inside out again and drop the bottle? I asked, watching the Jupiterian with interest. Because your whiskey has paralyzed him, answered the professor. He's quite helpless. I looked at the globe, which had alighted again. Each Jupiterian suddenly resumed his full size in a brave attempt to bound to the assistance of his chief, but creatures could no longer pass through the four-dimensional metal of which the globe was composed. So thick a layer of Chicago dust had settled upon it that, to all intents and purposes, it had become three-dimensional. The sudden impact of 600,000 bodies caused it to burst, and with a roar as of 100 peals of thunder exploding simultaneously, the air was filled with dead and dying Jupiterians. A dark cloud settled over the landscape, composed of the flying dust shaken from the Jupiterian globe by the explosion. Long streamers of electric fire shot from the fragments of the airship and seemed to curve in upon themselves. Everything ran in curves, the darkness, the clouds, the sounds, the shafts of light, as if bent in by the force of gravity. I put my hands up and fought the cloud that was settling down upon me. I seemed to be covered with falling feathers, and when the cloud began to lift, I found myself in my own parlor. The air was full of flying leaves, which I was madly tearing from a book and throwing towards the ceiling. The book was a treatise on the Einstein theory of space, which I had borrowed from a friend that afternoon. I had read nearly a page in it before I fell asleep. Only 12 men in the whole world understand the Einstein theory, it is said. If I had read the book, then I would have been the 13th, and that would have been unlucky. So it's just as well that it's been destroyed. But what excuse am I to give my friend for tearing up his book? Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Podcast Inside Your House. To hear every tale of terror as they're released, subscribe to our show on your podcast app or on YouTube, or follow us on Facebook and X. And until next time, try to have a good day today. At least, if you know what that means.